Well, I'd like to say good morning or evening to everyone. My name is Saumitra. I'm a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Freeman Spalding Institute for International Affairs. And I'm going to be joined here by Oyebola Okunogbe, who's of the World Bank. And we're going to talk to you today a bit about some of our pathfinding research on ethnic diversity and nation building. So if I may, I will just share my screen now. So this is a bit unusual in the sense that what we are trying to do in this project is really not just talk to you about the recent research in this area, but also identify things that we don't know and which might be fruitful for doing research going forward. So that's why we call it a pathfinding type of exercise. But I want to start with talking to you about some, some important facts that I want to put on the table. Um, as you can see, our title is called Breaking Through the Ethnic Growth Trap. So the first thing I'm going to try to do is discuss to you why I believe an ethnic growth trap exists, what it exists, and basically what is it to begin with. So this this graph is from Max Roser's amazing team at Oxford, where they basically in this case this is showing international dollars and GDP per capita, comparing 1950 countries in 1950 and countries in 2016. Now, it might be a bit hard to see on our screen, but basically, what I want to point you to is we've lived, this is a 50-year period of dramatic economic development and growth. It was a period when we learned so much about new technologies, so much about new management skills for solving important problems. And, there's good news on this picture, as you can see. There are a lot of countries grew, and some grew a lot. I mean, you can think about, some countries like South Korea, Oman, Taiwan, Singapore, that became 30 times richer during this period. At the same time, as you can see, this is not a uniform picture. There's a lot of variation here. The countries which were at very similar levels of development, in per capita terms in 1950, some grew 30 times and some actually shrunk. They actually ended up the period poorer than when they began. A lot of stagnation also occurred. And so I think a key challenge for us as development economists and policy people is to think about, well, why is it that, in a time when we understood and we learned so much, when the technology is really advanced, that we get such a great variation in performance? Why is it the countries that started off poor in this period, some of them remained poor? Now, it won't surprise you, given our theme, to see that a lot of these countries that you see down in this part of our graph are also places which have had extensive civil conflict. So this basically is a map I created of based on ACLED data as well as other data sources on major battles in the post-war period, as well as smaller conflicts from 1977. And as you can see, a bunch of the countries which were in this category over here, including Sierra Leone, Burundi, Afghanistan, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, are also places which had severe conflict in this period. And so conflict, sadly, is not a thing of the past. In fact, I don't need to tell anyone here that it's something that's with us, and distressingly so. But I think it's important to think before we kind of say, well, places, while it is true that places which have had experienced conflict in the past are more likely to experience conflict repeatedly in the future, there's sort of a development, as we're going to discuss, of abilities to mobilize and to engage in conflict, and institutions that often get put in place to help people mobilize along ethnic lines. It is important to remember that history is really not fate. If you look at the patterns of war and battles in the after the Napoleonic period until 1945, places which are now pretty peaceful, one might say, had extensive conflict as well. So things have changed, things can develop. And I think a key part of what we're trying to do is understand why. And in particular, how can one break through a potential ethnic growth trap? I want to kind of point out to you that some of the places, as we're going to focus a lot on Africa and Asia in this talk, but a bunch of the places which I think are worth mentioning are places which had extensive conflict, like Vietnam and South Korea, that have now developed quite considerably, as I just showed you. And part of that might be is that they're relatively ethnically homogeneous. On the other hand, there are places which have a fair amount of diversity, including India and parts of South Asia, some parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Indonesia, that continue to have low-level and sometimes larger-level conflicts that emerge. And so are there examples from history where people have actually managed to, ethnically diverse societies or caste-ridden societies have been able to break through this trap and manage to push forward in such a way that both the divisions that kind of potentially were stopping them from developing, as I'm going to describe, became less important, and instead they were able to develop kind of a stronger national characteristic as well as a stronger development trajectory. And one thing I'm going to talk to you about is how policymakers trying to solve this problem of how to bring together a fragmented society, how to bring together an ethnically diverse society, were able to do this in a number of different cases, and in particularly that of Japan. So kind of, but just to kind of go back to the big picture again, a classic paper that many of you are familiar with might be that of Alessina and Leferrara in the Journal of Economic Literature. They basically looked around the world, looked at kind of decades of this development period, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they tried to see what happened when, to countries which were more ethnically fractionized. The measure of fractionalization here is basically an inverse Herfindahl index. It's like the probability that two randomly selected people would be from different ethnic groups in a country, and they call that the fractionalization index. And what I want to show you here is the outcome here is economic growth. And what they find is that there's a negative relationship between ethnic fractionalization and economic growth in each of these times. However, the interaction with income is positive. So the way to think about that is poorer countries that are ethnically divided tend to grow slower. Richer countries which are ethnically mixed actually can sometimes grow faster. And so there's a bifurcation there. I want you to kind of keep in mind. In our pathfinding paper, we kind of discuss how you measure ethnic diversity is also often important because it's relevant for how people mobilize for politics. And in an important series of papers by Joan Esteban and De Brajere and co-authors, they've emphasized the fact that sometimes it's not really fractionalization, the fact that two random people might be from different ethnic groups that is important. It's sometimes the extent to which they identify as within themselves, they're similar within themselves, and they're polarized between themselves in such a way that sometimes politics becomes the most conflictual when people are able to compete for the big prize, winning control of the state, for example. And that can often happen when there are two very closely, similarly sized groups. So along those lines, an important paper by Jose Montalvo and Marta Reynal Carroll, that many of you are familiar with, construct a measure which they call the linguistic polarization measure. It's correlated with the fractionalization measure we discussed, but it's not perfectly so. So places like Tanzania, for example, which have many small ethnic groups, are highly fractionalized, but they're not polarized. And that's going to be relevant for the extent to which two different groups might mobilize for conflict. And what they find is that, yes, unlike fractionalization, which, as we've seen, is correlated with with reduced growth, polarization is correlated with more conflict. So the distribution of the ethnicities in a society can matter for conflict. Now, so this kind of motivates what, some ideas that about, could it be the case then that poor ethnically diverse societies find it hard, are more likely to face conflict. They're more likely to provide fewer public goods, largely because the more diverse you are, people might not internalize the gains to a broader society if they feel like another group is benefiting, or they might have very diverse views on what should be done in terms of the distribution of public goods. So there's extensive literature showing that ethnic divisions lower public goods. They increase conflict, and it wouldn't surprise you, as we've already seen, that they're also highly correlated with poverty and lack of growth. So as you can see, there are potentially a number of different feedback loops going on between these things, whether it be fractionalization or polarization. These things can kind of reaffirm ethnic divisions. Conflict can reduce the provision of public goods. Basically, it makes it more risky to invest. It also destroys capital physically. Lower public goods means lack of beneficial economic spillovers into poverty, which can impact poverty and lack of growth, less education spending. And all of these things can interact in such a way that countries which are poor and ethnically divided might, despite attempts to invest, remain poor and ethnically divided. So this is what I mean by an ethnic growth trap. Now, there are a number of different kind of features that I want to emphasize here, which are specific to ethnicity rather than just broader groups or of different kinds. And one of them is that you could have ethnic differences in preferences. Maybe different groups have different views about what we should be spending things on. There could also be, as I'm going to kind of provide some examples of, a situation where in many societies, your ethnicity often shapes your economic opportunities as well. People from different ethnic groups might come from different places with different endowments, different networks, and this makes this might increase potential ethnic competition between groups, but it could also induce a possibility for complementarity, that there are gains to be had from living in ethnically mixed societies because people can bring different things together and create new surpluses and new value. Kind of a third part of this is, even when these things exist, whether we have different ethnic preferences or we have different economic endowments because of our ethnicities, it's not obvious that we would mobilize as an ethnic group in order to contest and protect those things. So trying to understand where the capacity for ethnic mobilization comes from is also an area that I think that I'm going to talk about, and I think we need to understand better. A fourth part of this is, of course, the impact on governance and institutions, so in ethnically divided societies. So we're going to talk a bit about that as well. So this is why we think there might be an ethnic growth trap, keeping poor countries and ethnically divided countries poor. So it also motivates a research agenda that we want to encourage you all to think about as well, which is, maybe surprising for us as economists, that context, first of all, matters, that one size is not going to fit all. And in fact, different places which are ethnically divided are going to be ethnically divided for different reasons. And we need to understand which of these can provide potential for economic development and growth, and which ones are going to provide potential for ethnic mobilization, and which ones might actually induce more competition and more conflict as well. So the first pillar of our research program is to think about, okay, what are the historical and contemporary drivers of ethnic coalition? Given that it's so challenging in poor societies to live in ethnically divided environments, why is it that then people choose oftentimes to co-locate? Is, I think, a key question that we need to resolve in order to understand what the policies should be for encouraging growth in those societies. So that's pillar one, diagnosing what are the contemporary drivers of ethnic co-location. The second is the effects on formal government and the interactions with formal institutions and effective governance. So how do governments manage this, and how does ethnicity play into the way that governments and governmental institutions are effective or not? And the third part is on the informal side, trying to understand how networks, informal institutions, and potential interpersonal relationships can either hinder or foster economic development across ethnic lines. So we're not going to talk so much about these, the destruction of capital and the lack of beneficial economic spillovers. We'll leave that to another theme in this course. But these are the three pillars that we are going to be focusing on in the ethnicity and nation building theme. So just to kind of reiterate, these three pillars really kind of raise a number of questions that I think are important for us to think. I want you to think about, and we've been thinking about to some extent. One is, on the root side, what are the sources of ethnic polarization in different contexts? Are there opportunities for complementarities between ethnic groups that can be leveraged to enhance peace and public goods provision rather than reduce it? And where does internal ethnic organization come from? In the second pillar is about strengthening governance. I'm going to highlight some features of ethnically divided societies which make it sometimes challenging to maintain strong governmental systems. And in particular, this phenomenon known as ethnic cronyism that I'm going to describe in a moment, where oftentimes vulnerable minority ethnic groups sometimes try to buy protection from people who are prominent in the majority, often government leaders at the very top. And this can lead to corruption and a lack of local accountability, as well as potential ethnic tension as well. There are other paths that we can also explore, like power sharing arrangements, building venues for mediating conflict as well, which we aren't going to talk too much about today, but are definitely important things to think about as well. So the third aspect of this, the third pillar, is about networks and positive contact. And some of the questions we're going to raise are, can we leverage financial innovations, interethnic complementarity in existing or new spheres to actually, where ethnic divisions become an asset and a resource that can help people grow together rather than being a curse, shall we say, which results in the ethnic growth trap. So I'm going to very quickly talk through some of these four boxes, and then I'm going to hand it over to Oyebola, who's, of course, an expert on on many things, but especially the fourth box. So I'm going to try and keep this as untechnical as possible and emphasize examples that I think are illuminating, and some open areas for research as we go along. So, as I should mention, please we will be addressing questions at the end because we have a lot to go through. I hope you don't mind. But please keep your questions in mind as we go along. So one thing I've been very interested in is the role of interethnic complementarities in business relationships. And you might think the first thing is obvious. At least as early as Montesquieu, people have argued that commerce encourages civility between individuals due to mutual self-interest. You don't want to be mean or harmful to people who you're doing business with, because that they probably wouldn't want to do business with you in the future, and so you lose the future stream of trade or interaction. And this is also the case with ethnic groups. But I'm sure many of you have already in mind that there are many, oftentimes even the most commercially oriented business minorities or even expatriate firms are often the focuses of violence and expropriation. And there are many minority groups that have faced this challenge in the past, and not in the too distant past as well. So it kind of raises the issue, under what conditions can interethnic complementarities or business or trade really support and enhance development? Under what conditions then does it lead to violence instead? Now, bear with me, please, but we're going to go back 1,000 years. And so this, we're going to go back 1,000 years to the coast of Gujarat. So this is the Somnath temple, this little thing here on the coast of Gujarat. It's one of the most famous temples in India. And one of the reasons it's one of the most famous temples is that it was in 1026, so quite a long time ago. It was sacked by an Afghan cavalryman called Mahmud of Ghazni, who took his cavalry down from the mountains, sacked the temple, killed an unknown number of its inhabitants, and it is believed, it's also believed these included some of my ancestors. Clearly not all my ancestors, but you know, it is believed some of my ancestors. So ever since then, you know, people have argued. Al-Baruni, who was there at the time, said that, well, Hindus and Muslims in South Asia have hated each other because of this, you know, cataclysmic sacking of this temple. But I want to point you to these things over here. These are graves. These are, so within a few years of the sacking of this temple, the rebuilt temple authorities invited a Muslim trader, Niruddin Firuz of Hormuz, to settle on the temple lands because they knew that by doing so, they would enable trade links with the Middle East, and where, you know, for 1 month every year for 1,000 years, Makkah and the Hajj and other pilgrimage routes coordinated trade such that this local region could become enriched by having and protecting its religious and ethnic minorities. That community still exists, and even though this is seen as like a very, you know, visceral, painful moment in history, it's also a place where there has been a lot of religious and ethnic tolerance as well, and persistently so. So Somnath and other of these medieval ports actually remained oases of peace, even in kind of very, very violent times, like in 2002 when there was a sacking, when a railway carriage caught fire in Godhra, carrying Hindu activists, and this led to riots throughout the state, which led to more than 1,000 people killed, mostly Muslims, and 98,000 forced into refugee camps. These medieval ports became oases of peace in those moments. In fact, if you look at all the medieval ports, these little triangles around South Asia, and you compare it to, you know, these places tended to attract more mixed societies. They tended to have more Muslims, relatively speaking, than other places. But they had much fewer religious violence, much less religious violence. In fact, 5 times fewer religious riots, even in a time when there was a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of religious violence. So why did these Muslim businesses in Indian ports enjoy 1,000 years of peace? Well, this is Sheikh Zainuddin al-Ma'abari, who's actually writing in a book called The Gift to the Holy Warrior. So he's not really a Mr. Peace kind of guy, but he describes it as basically because these ports benefited from the trade that Muslims brought. And people were aware of this. They paid attention, much regard to their prejudice and customs, and avoided any act of aggression, except on extraordinary provocation. And even he finds it remarkable that this was taking place, even though the Muslims in the population were not more than 1/10 of that population at that time. So they were very vulnerable, but there was a lot of peace. And in fact, these ports competed with each other to attract trade. So in a series of works, I've been looking at the conditions under which complementarities can enhance development across ethnic lines. And well, the first thing, there are a number of conditions which are important, but I want to spell a couple of them out to you right now. One is, of course, that you need the complementarity. Rather than having groups compete, you actually need, it's been very beneficial to have an exogenous reason why they would want to trade. And in this case, there was. For 1 month every year for 1,000 years, Mecca was the largest textile market in the world, and you had to be a Muslim to go to Mecca. So for 1,000 years, Muslim traders dominated trade in the Indian Ocean, going all the way up through Indonesia and even to China. So there's a Muslim-specific advantage. It's also very difficult for locals to expropriate or replicate. So even a large set of Hindus could not replicate the scale of the Hajj. And it's also intangible. You can't seize a trading network, unlike land, machines, or other things which could be basically expropriated, even if they were initially a source of complementarity, or even human capital, which should sometimes be replicated as well. A third aspect of it was there's a non-violent way to share some of the gains from trade. So whenever, so in principle, any Muslim could go to Mecca, and whenever there was more demand for Muslim goods and services, you would get more immigration and sometimes conversion, and you would have, as a result, more competition within Muslims, and this would sort of share some of the gains from trade with the broader population as well. The fourth part is this created a set of incentives for reinforcing trust between ethnic groups, and including provisions of public goods, as I'm going to provide you a few examples of, but also developing norms of of trust, the ability of these groups to basically interact and invest together, and business relationships and organizations over time as well. There's some exogenous, you want an exogenous source of these things, and so we have a natural experiment to study things. I'm not going to get into that, but because I want to kind of get into the sort of some of the effects that you see today. So these medieval ports, which are these focuses of trade between Hindus and Muslims for 1,000 years, they stayed much more tolerant places for much longer. And many of them actually did ultimately experience some religious violence, but it happened later in India's, South Asia's history, and has tended to be much less violent than places around them. They also, if you look at household data, even today, places where the medieval port towns are places where Hindus and Muslims are much more equitable in their wealth distribution compared to other urban areas of India. Muslims in medieval ports continue to be specialized in particular types of activities, including trade activities as well. They also developed organizations and other ways to basically this social capital to keep things together. This is reflected in trust as well, that Muslims in medieval ports actually were more likely to vaccinate their kids against polio, which, as many of you know, was a kind of a meme at a time when people thought that polio vaccines would actually sterilize children, and there's hesitancy in some minority communities. So I won't go into this, but I'll say, but you can see numerous examples of, if you go to the fieldwork in these places, which I have, where places where there's ethnic competition, places like Ahmedabad, which is also a very rich city, but one where Hindus and Muslims used to live side by side, but built walls and literal gates between them because they didn't trust each other, differ a lot from what you see in these medieval ports, where actually these organizations became sources of public goods provision and relief. I need to speed up because I'm already at half an hour, well, slightly under that. But so we've talked about ethnic complementarity. One question that comes up is, well, how, even if you have ethnic competition, why would groups mobilize, and how do they get the capacity to mobilize on ethnic lines instead of, just competing in the economic sphere? And so there's a bunch of research recently looking at sort of traditional informal organizations, whether it be chiefs or whether it be segmentary lineages in some societies, which kind of create this potential for conflict, that groups can basically are organized within themselves such that they are able to engage in conflict between each other. So there's historical reasons why you might have more conflict in places which are these hashed places with the segmentary lineages. There's also more recent shocks, for example, mobilization for war. So some of my work has also looked at how soldiers who were subsequently sent in to fight in the Second World War came back, and this led to more ethnic-based mobilization when they came home in India during the partition. One thing we're speculating is, well, if you look at the pattern of violence which has happened in sub-Saharan Africa, whether some of that might have both this deep historical root in terms of ethnic mobilization, or whether it might have something to do with more recent mobilization for war, including whether you were mobilized by the British to fight in World War II. So, what are the kind of implications for today? Well, I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna give you I'm going to skip this example, which we published in another journal before, where actually one of my students actually engineered complementarity between different ethnic groups and was able to engineer a way where there was incentives for them to develop peaceful relationships with each other. And I'm going to talk instead about kind of how it's been doing. Another example in sub-Saharan Africa, which we emphasize in our pathfinding paper. And this is related to another one of these Muslim trading groups, in this case, the Ismaili community of East Africa, which many of you are familiar with. So one important, as I mentioned, one important sort of theme in history and in contemporary politics is oftentimes, particularly potentially prosperous ethnic groups, minorities, will have an incentive to try to protect themselves. And one way you can protect yourselves is by protection from oftentimes from people who can give you that protection, or heads in state, and so on and so forth. So oftentimes we see a phenomenon known as ethnic cronyism, where vulnerable minorities try to buy protection, and this can lead to some corrupt activities as well. So, many of you might be familiar with the Goldenberg scandal in Kenya. South Africa has some of the, under Zuma, had some of these types of activities as well. But it's not inevitable that this be the case. And so one example of this is the Ismaili community in East Africa, where even all the way back to the 19th century, they've adopted a different strategy. For example, the Ismaili merchant Taria Topen, he endowed the first hospital or dispensary in Zanzibar. And there's a long history, both at the individual level and at the broader community level, of philanthropy. So in order sharing the gains from trade, there are two ways to basically manage political risk. Either you focus on the person, one single person, or you can kind of share the gains from trade more broadly. And so philanthropy can play that role. So ironically, ethnic divisions can lead to more public goods provision, not less. Secondly, one thing that this community has been doing is actually matching people, Ismailis and non-Ismailis, along complementary lines to create new business ventures. And I think this is and they've done this for more than 100 different activities. This seems like a very promising way to basically leverage interethnic complementarity, and something I think is worthy of studying going forward. This isn't true, however, everywhere. So as I mentioned, sometimes you are in a situation where ethnic minorities tend to be much more connected with the political leader. And this is a classic paper by Ray Fisman, which shows that companies which were connected with Suharto, when he was, many of them with Chinese minority leadership, were deeply affected in terms of their stock price whenever he got sick during this period. But more generally, I want to kind of end by saying, well, one possibility is that finance can actually provide an opportunity to bring people together in new ways, because shed of its sort of all the kind of baggage of Main Street versus Wall Street, it really is about credibly sharing the future in particular ways. Now, there are ways that people have done this countries have done this more recently, where they've sort of, in essence, in the aftermath of conflict, or the potential for conflict, they've tried to create these shareholding relationships, including Malaysia and South Africa, across ethnic lines. But I want to instead emphasize Japan's example, which, as I talked about at the beginning, seems like a very fruitful one for thinking about how to break through the ethnic growth trap. Why is that? Well, I think coming from a South Asian background, I think Japan's experience is really, really interesting for a number of reasons. One of them is that it has had a more entrenched caste system than South Asia, than India does. They had more than around 6% of the population were samurai. They were an endogamous caste who had a monopoly over violence and administration. They'd recently militarized in the 1860s after the American ships tried to open Japan. And they were the biggest potential losers to reforms, which the Meiji reformers were trying to implement. Japan itself had all this potential for violence, because they had these samurai, but they were also organized in clans, each of them basically owing allegiance to a particular person, a daimyo, or in a particular area. Yet Japan was able to pull it all together. And part of the story we've been studying is the role of finance in doing that. So instead of their traditional rights obligations, the Meiji reformers, Matsukata Masayoshi and Okuma, basically gave them bonds. They gave them government of Japan bonds and allowed them to capitalize banks. So you had to, in order to create a national bank, you needed 80% samurai bonds and 20% gold or silver from non-samurai. So this created these large-scale cross-ethnic institutions. And there was a dramatic expansion of bank branches across Japan. So what seemed to happen is that there was, these cross-ethnic institutions persisted. Violent samurai revolts ended, and instead the ex-samurai began to agitate for constitutional rights. And it really, not only did it align the incentives credibly of the samurai with development, it also undermined the ethnic divisions over time. In fact, we don't think of Japan as a caste-ridden society anymore. It's nowhere like what we have in India. So there were two caste, I'm going to end with this because it's, there were two caste conflict challenges that the reformers had to think about. And they used two different types of banks to deal with this. One is, locally, the samurai were losing all their privileges, these cultural, visceral things that made them distinct from the rest of the population, like their top knots, like their right to have a surname, like the two swords that they had, and their monopoly over being in the army and administration, but they were allowed to invest in banks. And you can see these red things are where banks spreading across the castle towns where the samurai were meant to live throughout Japan in this period. So locally, they're now invested in local silk merchants, cotton merchants, and there's incentive locally to not kill or not fight back and turn back the modernization process because you're invested locally in these activities which benefit from peace. A second aspect, though, was there was still this potential for mobilization, as we was talking about in the case of these army veterans and so on and so forth, or these segmentary lineages. In Japan, you had these strong clan affiliations. And so what they did is they took the people at the very top and they gave them a specific bank called the Katsoku Bank, the 15th bank, which dwarfed the others in terms of its size. And it had exclusive right to invest in a number of different projects. Firstly, to protect, it was used to fund the government when it was putting down a samurai rebellion, and secondly, to invest in the railway network, so which integrates the country. So instead of this one, these groups trying to break away and create new, reintroduce feudal states in Japan, they were now invested in national integration projects. And I think both of those two different types of banks were very successful and fruitful in keeping the country together at a very difficult time. So this is true more generally, and it's happened in history. The Japanese were learning from the American experience and that of the British and the French before that. And so I want to kind of turn it over to Oyebola and say, and to say we can learn from this too. We've been running field experiments in Israel around the Brexit referendum, in Mexico, and in the US, where we've found that providing people with the ability to invest in shares and learn by doing in the stock market has been able to bring them together in more peaceful, change their attitudes towards peace, increase their financial literacy and investment, and also support democracy. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Oyebola for the final pillar of our discussion.
Thank you, Saumitra. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you and to have you all on here joining us today. I am going to be going on this third pillar that Saumitra had mentioned, which are different approaches that governments around the world take to build a sense of national integration and to build unity among their population. So we've seen different historical examples from different parts of the world. We're going to move to Nigeria now, and we're going to look at something that's a very contemporary policy that government is working on. So there's different policies that countries have used, especially think post-colonial countries. You're now independent, and now you're trying to build a sense of national identity. And one of the approaches that countries have taken is national service. So typically, this is a program that would require youth to live in a different part of the country and perform some kind of national service. And the goals are typically to expose them to national diversity, to foster loyalty to this nation, to build civic responsibility. There are many examples of this. Just in Africa, there are 18 countries that have these types of programs and 73 globally. The biggest in Africa is in Nigeria, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So this in Nigeria, it's called the National Youth Service Corps, NYSC for short. I'm just trying to hide this video pan. Oh, no. I'm trying to... There we go. Okay. It's called the National Youth Service Corps. It was started in 1973, and we've been talking about different types of conflicts in countries. This was a response actually to the civil war in Nigeria. So there was a 3-year civil war, and after the war, the president at the time, Gowon, decided that having a program that brought together the future leaders of the country, so university graduates, would be important to create a to reunite the country. And so the NYSC is a 1-year program. It's compulsory for all college graduates who finish their education before they turn 30. It's a very large program. It's about 350,000 participants every year. It costs about 500 million every year, which is huge. So in comparison, this is about a quarter of the health budget in Nigeria. And the key feature that we're going to be studying is that it's going to randomly assign participants to one of the 37 states of the country, so different from their state of origin. And the main goals were to promote this national unity, but also to be able to send manpower, so teachers, different professionals to different parts of the country as soon as they finish their college education. This is just a picture to show. So they have these uniforms that they wear when they're on the camp, orientation camp at the beginning of the program. And then they spent a whole year in a specific institution. It could be a government organization, it could be a private sector organization that the government posts people to. So the key question in this paper that I ask is, what is the impact of temporary relocation to another ethnic region on individuals' attitudes and actions that are important for national integration, compared to simply being exposed to a diverse group of peers? And I'll go into more detail for this. So the key features that to emphasize here is that 1, people are actually moving to a new part of the country. 2 is that the sample that I'm going to be looking at are one of the 3 largest ethnic groups in Nigeria. So by the time they move to another region, they become a minority. And the 3rd is that this is longer term outcomes that we collect 7 years later. So the research design is that we're going to be comparing participants who are Yorubas. So this is one of the 3 groups, again, like I mentioned. So some of them are going to be assigned to serve in their own ethnic region, and others will be assigned to serve in a non-Yoruba state. And so when we have these 2 groups, we're going to be comparing them to look at the impact of being sent to a different ethnic region. This is just to show what the distribution of Yorubas look like in Nigeria. So they're all concentrated in the southwest of the country. And so 95% of Yorubas live in the Yoruba region. And so for people, typically, all of my sample is going to come from this region. And so they've lived as a majority. And now the treatment would be to send them to a different ethnic region. The data is from the national agency that administers this and from university. And there's lots of focus groups and interviews with participants from different universities. And then the key source of the outcomes that I'll be showing you are from an alumni survey with a cohort that finished in 2008. So the data were collected 7 years after they finished. So all of this is just details on how the randomization is done, which I'm going to skip. But all of that to know is that people are comparable. So the people who served in their own ethnic region are very similar to those who served in a different ethnic region. This is the empirical specification, but I'm going to jump straight into the results. So there are 5 key dimensions of national integration that's the study is looking at. And these are all the objectives of the program from the outset. So number 1 was the degree and quality of interactions with the host community. It's possible for people to be hosted to another region and then they just huddle among themselves and they don't want to interact with the people in the host communities. And the goal of the program was that they want the youth to be exposed to the modes of living of different people in different parts of Nigeria. Number 2 outcome is future migration. The NYSC charter states that it wanted the members of the service corps to seek, at the end of their 1-year national service, career employment all over Nigeria, thus promoting the free movement of labor. 3rd is the knowledge of other states. How the goal was to remove prejudice and eliminate ignorance and to show that all Nigerians are actually quite similar. 4 is promoting national and ethnic identity. To be able to promote national identity, it says to promote a sense of corporate existence and common destiny of the people of Nigeria. 5th is promoting relationships with other ethnic groups. It says to develop common ties among Nigerian youths and promote national unity and integration. Here we now have the specific outcomes and the results. Okay, so the first question is, who did you interact with during your service year? And we are seeing, asking which of these ethnic groups did you interact with? And then the next one is asking about their experiences with the communities where they were living in. So here, what this graph is showing, so this first set of 3 bars are the people who were posted to a Yoruba state. So these are the people who are our control group in a sense. And what we see from here is that the majority of the interactions were with Yorubas, not surprisingly. If we move to the people who were posted to a Hausa state, that's another ethnic group, we see here that the majority of interactions that people then had was with Hausa participants. And similar with northern minority states, which has a lot of Hausas, we see the same pattern for those that are posted to an Igbo state. They are most likely to interact with Igbos, and then with the southern minority states. So this shows that we have a first stage, meaning that people actually are interacting with the people in the host communities where they go to, which is important. The next outcome is on their future migration. So how likely are they to live outside their own ethnic region? And here, our control group, only 3% of them are living outside the Yoruba region. Like I said, when I showed you that first graph, it's a lot of people concentrated in their own ethnic region. Whereas in the treatment group, 17.6% of them are now likely to be living in a non-Yoruba region. This these next 2 bars are checking whether they're living in the same state where they did their national service. So this is 7 years later, but are they just in the same state they served? So maybe they got a job there after the service and decided to stay. But we see that there is still a significant impact on living in a state that's not where you served. The third outcome is, are you living in the region where you served? You might think people learn the language or some other ways of having ties to that new region. But here we're seeing that even if restricted to people who are not living in the region where they serve, there's still a 3-fold impact on the likelihood of living in a non-Yoruba state. Next is testing the knowledge of people. And here we ask, what is the governor and the capital of the state? And what we find here again is that the people in who were sent to serve in a non-Yoruba state are more likely to be able to correctly answer the name of the state governor of a non-Yoruba state, as well as the capital of the state. Whereas those who are sent to serve in a Yoruba region, there we see no impact. Next is just some qualitative evidence on how this affected people. So and this is helpful for when governments are trying to build these types of programs, because what we find here is that people's minds seems to have really expanded. It's an opening, almost like mental barriers were taken off, in the sense of people say, before I used to be afraid of these other groups, but now because I've been exposed to them, I'm no longer scared to go to those regions. I'm no longer scared. I now feel like the whole country belongs to me. Mark's outcome is on national pride. And here we have an interesting result where we do see that being exposed to another region, sent to serve somewhere else, increases people's pride in being Nigerian. We also at the same time see an increase in pride of being Yoruba, which is their own ethnicity. And when you have the choice, this question is saying if you have the choice to choose your ethnicity or being Nigerian, which one would you choose? Here we see no impact. So what this is showing is that people are actually not choosing one at the expense of the other. They're seeing the broader country, they're realizing that they're part of something bigger than themselves, but then this is actually strengthening their national identity. At the same time, they're immersed in another group as a minority, their own ethnic identity becomes more salient to them. And so they're more conscious and proud of their own ethnicity as well. And what we see is that those two things can actually coexist. We ask about attitudes and relationships with other groups. And let me just summarize what we find here. We actually don't see much of a difference in the attitudes towards Yorubas and non-Yorubas. one important thing to remind us here is that even our control group, they're all exposed to a diverse cohort of peers. So the randomized assignment is going to mean that in each state of the country, it's bringing together graduates from all over the country. So people, you're mixing with other ethnic groups, you're working together, you're serving together. So we think that there's some layer, this is now a speculation, there's no way from this design to be able to prove it, but that there's some layer of inter-ethnic relationships that have been fostered already even among our control group. And what we're seeing now is that being now immersed is not, you don't have more of an intensive margin effect on that. Instead, what you see here is that it seems that this other mechanism of being a minority immersed in another group is reinforcing people's identity. We do see more positive relationship, and we see positive impacts on the likelihood of dating other ethnic groups. And we think this is really because of the proximity you have to them. If you're serving there, if you're living in another part of the country, you're more exposed to people from other parts. And so we see more inter-ethnic relationships. Very a small share, like only 30% of the sample were married at the time of the survey. And so we do see some a positive coefficient, but not statistically significant on marriage, but we do see it clearly on dating. And so this is really just one very specific example of a policy that one, Nigeria, largest country in Africa, has been doing now for over 50 years of trying to integrate the people, its citizens after the Civil War. And we see that the physical relocation of its youth outside of the ethnic region is expanding physical and mental boundaries. At the same time, it's reinforcing their own pride in their ethnicity because they're immersed in another group. And this one major takeaway here is that, unlike there's a statement from one of the former African presidents that says, for the nation to live, the ethnic group must die. And instead here, we actually find both of them thriving together. So I will stop it here now, just with this kind of deep dive into the Nigeria case study, and then allow for questions. We can now go and take questions in the last few minutes that we have.
And maybe I can pose some of the questions for you that have been coming up in the
Okay,
chat.
I'm just reading. Did you want to answer any from the beginning, or should I just dive right into some of it?
So Kushi Jen asks, what happens if the National Service Program is also militarized? Are there some features which it must have to actually work to enhance peace?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. The one in Nigeria is it's completely civil service, so there's no military element to it. There are other papers in Spain in particular I can think of that actually use the posting of the military to different parts of the country, and they do see some of the similar effects where people, even though they were serving in military, but just from the fact of being exposed to other people from other parts of the country, there's something about serving together. There's a lot of trust that is built by when you serve with people, your life depends on theirs. So I think that even though it's war, it's military work, it could actually still lead to some kind of national unity in that sense. But some of the features in general that one would think for these types of programs would be where there's equal footing of the peers. You can't have like some elites. You can't, it must not reinforce societal divisions. So for instance, you see these people in uniforms, they try to put everybody in an equal playing field and, to have positive interactions that they have with one another. Yeah. Yes, so going to the next question about all the differences. I skipped that slide because of time. So this is by Kay Abbott. Where it says, is this just examining contact, the old idea, you discovered a new region, so areas are not secure. So one thing in the study that I went over very quickly is that we can consider other characteristics of different parts of the country. So for instance, the level of ethnic diversity in the host community, the poverty level of the host community, religion, the differences, and control for all of those, because it's a bundle, right? If you're sent to another state, it's a bundle of things that you're sent to. So we can control for these other prominent differences. And there we still see this effect, suggesting that the exposure to a new group is a big part of it. And so this is in part contact hypothesis, but with a slight twist, because the control group is also experiencing the contact hypothesis in a very real way because they are mixing with a diverse group of peers. I think I mentioned this briefly. And so what this is really picking up is compared to people who are also now meeting people from other parts of the country, exposed to ethnicities that previously they would not have been exposed to, but the main thing is that they're having this exposure in a different region. So it's more of that physical relocation that we think this is particularly teasing out.
If I may, I might answer a question as well. Billy raises this question about region-based divisions, that there might be historical animosity between provinces in South Korea caused by past events, and maybe even in ethnically homogeneous societies, you can have strong regional identities. So I think it kind of ties to what you were sort of talking about, Oyebola, and some of what I was talking about. I think that so our emphasis in this theme is on ethnic diversity and the challenges here, but I think regional identities can also be very strong, as you point out, Billy. I think one of the advantages there is that there are economic ways of transferring resources to regions and have regional development programs and things which are, which can be sort of, which don't kind of necessarily reaffirm regional identities. If people find it easy to move from one place to another, which is a big if, this can kind of spread development around. For example, China has a famous like Go West program to kind of develop the underdeveloped parts of China, and I guess we have a sense where economic development, programs which emphasize underdeveloped areas, greenfield area projects, can be a way of mitigating that. But when you introduce the ethnic component, that's when it becomes a bit more contentious. Well, is it my greenfield for my ethnic group or your greenfield for your ethnic group, and so on and so forth. But I think that oftentimes they can have this feature as well. Did you have something to add on that, Oyebola?
Yeah, not on that specific one. There was another question that just answered in the chat about, is it about people discover a new region and then they want to live in that specific region from the national Nigeria example. But here we saw that it's not only the state or even the region where you serve that you're more likely to live in, you're actually more likely to also live in other parts of the country. So it suggests it's more of a opening of the mind, like a reduction of the mental barriers that people have to unfamiliar places very broadly. Yeah.
Great. Well, it looks like we're at time, and we will be sharing the slides afterwards, and we hope that this will be the beginning of a conversation that you'll keep in touch with us, on various types of channels, and we hope you are convinced that that ethnicity and ethnic divisions create specific challenges which are hard for development, but also potential possibilities as well. And so, given that many of the poorest countries are ethnically divided potentially because of this ethnic growth trap, I think these are some of the most pressing questions that we could be addressing as development policymakers and academics. So I hope you'll join us as we kind of, we pursue this theme, and as part of the recipe funding window, we'll have opportunities for graduate students as well as researchers to gain some funds, hopefully, if things work out. And so, thanks so much. As Banke is pointing out here, we have the next feature is on gender inequality and conflict, and I hope you will join the recipe team on that next week.